and welcome to this year's Homeschooling Global Summit. I am excited to introduce Dr. Kristy Goodwin. She is one of Australia's leading health and well-being experts. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Kristy.
Great to be here.
Great, and I'd like to begin by asking you, how did you become an expert in digital health and well-being, and why did this all start for you?
I'm going to be completely transparent and say that it was through a series of serendipitous events that led me into this space of being a digital wellbeing researcher and speaker. I had been an educator for 14 years in both early childhood and primary school here in Australia, and then I became an academic, and my research was looking at the impact of technology on children's learning, so on their cognition and on their physical health and wellbeing. And then I experienced life's greatest equalizer, and I became a parent for the first time, and my son was born. This isn't how I date his chronological age, but it's important for this story. He was born 6 months after the first iPad came out. So we went to our paediatrician and got the all clear for his 6-month developmental check, but I was the A-type overachieving first-time mum, and I worried the paediatrician might have missed something. So I took my son to our local healthcare clinic nurse and said, look, could you just repeat the 6-month check? My second son, I did his 6-month check at 12 months, and my third son hasn't even had, and he's just gone almost 1.5, didn't have his 6-month check, but my first son, I did it twice. And so I sat down with the local healthcare clinic nurse, and she started to ask me all the regular questions you'd expect at a 6-month developmental check. Was he having tummy time? Was he, babbling? Had he started solids? And then she turned and asked me what screen time he was having. Now, in Australia, we don't have, at our 6-month developmental checks, we don't ask about screen time. In many countries, I know particularly in the US, part of the pediatric screening is asking that. So I heard this question and I was actually quite relieved. I thought, wow, we're actually taking a positive step forward and talking to parents in Australia about screen time. And I said, well, he's not having any, he's 6 months of age. And she leaned a little closer and she wagged her finger and she did the... And this healthcare professional proceeded to tell me that my son would fall behind, that he should, at 6 months of age, been learning colours, shapes and numbers and nursery rhymes on a touch screen. And she also prescribed that he should be watching Baby Einstein DVDs. Now, I was flabbergasted. I knew that this was factually incorrect information. And I knew as a parent what confusing and conflicting advice we were often given around kids and screen time. So I took my son home and he had one of those anomaly 4-hour naps. He didn't usually do this. But on this particular day, he had a very long nap. And in his nap time that day, I was so outraged that I did 2 things. The first thing I did was start a social media campaign that babies need laps, not apps. And it went viral. And I shared my experience with the healthcare nurse. And the second thing I did, because he was having such a long nap, was I thought I'm going to write a book about this topic. I felt like I was in a really privileged position to have access to research and science in this place, in this space. But I knew, having been a former teacher, that we often had limited time to go and read peer-reviewed academic research journals. And I knew as a parent how confused I was trying to navigate this digital terrain. And it was, I guess, the rest is history. From that point in time, the need, and in Australia, it happened, I published my book around the same time schools started to implement the bring your own device to school program. And so many parents, I actually think it's a universal dilemma that parents face around screen time. Many schools were saying, we need to support our parents because parents are really grappling with this. So that is a very long-winded explanation of how I literally fell into this work.
Wow, that's so interesting. So it wasn't like you left teaching and saw the need for this and it all fell into place for you personally and then professionally. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
And
yeah,
past the young age for young children, and how can we prepare students that are at school age, maybe at elementary age, like children and teens, to use technology as a positive reinforcement?
Yes, and I really love that notion of how can we look for the positive potential. I think, unfortunately, in the popular media, we're constantly bombarded by the doom and gloom. The media loves to demonize technology and children, and we only ever hear the negative impacts of technology. And yes, there is certainly research that tells us if it's used excessively, inappropriately, or prematurely, there are some negative impacts. But equally, we have a growing body of research that tells us that there are positive benefits. And so this is where I think we need to really, I believe, digital amputation isn't the solution. Banning technology, telling kids it's bad for them or it's taboo or it's toxic isn't a long-term solution. The reality is, whether we love it or loathe it, technology is and will continue to be an integral part of our children's lives. So I believe it's about planning, not banning technology. It's about trying to find the positive potential. And I think, during the recent health pandemic, we have really begun to realise that technology is a portal for our kids. It's a portal for learning. I couldn't imagine doing homeschooling or remote learning without access to digital technologies. It is a portal for collaboration and communication. One of the things that many of us experienced throughout the world was physical distancing, but not social distancing. The fact that we can connect and collaborate in real time with our peers, our family members, if we're adults, with our colleagues. And it's also, let's be honest, a portal for our leisure. Many of us, including adults, use the online space as a way to consume information, to be entertained, to gather knowledge. So I think it's about really tapping into the positive potential and at the same time mitigating the potential pitfalls that it also poses. And the only way kids can do that is by actually having exposure and use of the technology itself.
Wow. And I think that going back to what the pediatrician did recommend, and then you did your own research, were they correct in saying this is appropriate for 6 months? And how do we gauge the time that is appropriate as they grow older?
Yes, great question. So I'll answer the first part. The reason I was so flabbergasted is because all of the research and science tells us that at this point in time, there is no empirical evidence whatsoever to say that the early introduction of screens is beneficial, despite the claims on apps that are marketed as being educational, particularly under 2 years of age. What we know, in fact, the brain is incapable of making meaning from a 2D screen and extrapolating that to the real 3D world until a child is somewhere between 18 and 36 months. So yes, they'll want to watch a screen because, there's transitions and there's colors and there's sounds, etc. But their brain actually can't understand what they're seeing on a screen. So there's no evidence at this point in time. And the big risk, in fact, I believe this is a risk not just with little children, but with children and adolescents. The thing when it comes to technology is we've got to look at the opportunity cost. What is it displacing? If our children's basic developmental priorities are being met, if they're physically active, if they're getting sufficient sleep, if they're having real relationships, if they're playing, if they're getting good quality language experiences, then we don't have to fret and have all this moral panic around technology because their basic needs are being met. And I guess in those early years, that's the concern, that given children are awake for such limited hours and given that they can't actually make meaning from the screen, it's that opportunity cost. So the second part of your question is how much time? And I will tell you, I speak to parents throughout the world, predominantly in Australia and Asia, and it doesn't matter what place I go to, the universal digital dilemma that every parent grapples with is the $1 million how much. How much is healthy? How much is harmful? And each country does have recommended screen time guidelines, and they're fairly consistent. There's some, minor variations, but I actually don't endorse prescribing an amount of time. My concern is that, first of all, the guidelines that we have never been empirically validated. So there's never been a study that says, for most countries, including here in Australia, our guideline is for no more than 2 hours a day for primary school students. And that is for their leisure screen time. That doesn't include what they're doing for learning. That is sort of more of a passive leisure type activity or sedentary activity. However, that 2 hour limit has never been empirically examined to say that is a precise, exact amount. Anything over that and you're in dangerous territory, and anything under that, we're letting our kids fall behind. I guess my biggest concern is if we only use time as the only metric, we fail to overlook the bigger picture. Screen time, I believe, is, the amount of time they spend online is just one piece of the puzzle. We need to have more nuanced conversations. I think we need, as parents, to be looking at what is it that our kids are doing on devices? Is it leisure? Is it learning? Is it active? Is it passive? Is it age appropriate? Looking at when, times of the day that children use devices have a huge impact on their psychological well-being, on their capacity to sleep, on their capacity to pay attention. We need to have boundaries around where they're using devices. Where are the no-go tech zones in your house? Boundaries around how, given that our kids are, I think all of us would agree, spending more time plugged in, are they using them in ways that will support their vision and their hearing and their musculoskeletal health? So I think we need to broaden our concept of screen time beyond just the how much piece. So I've really dodged your question, giving an exact amount of time, but I'm basically saying there's no exact science. We don't have exact amounts of time based on a child's chronological age. Instead, what I suggest is a really simple formula, and it works for toddlers and teenagers. When it comes to screen time, we need to ask ourselves, are my children meeting their 7 basic developmental needs? So my research looks at developmental psychology and looks at neuroscience, and I fall back on that because I'm cautious Kristy. I want to know, what does science and research tell us unequivocally that kids need for optimal development and well-being? And it's the basics. I often say the basics work if you work the basics. And so kids need relationships, they need language, they need sleep, they need play, they need physical movement, they need good quality nutrition, and they need to develop executive function skills, which are sort of their higher order thinking skills. And so if we were to put all of those 7 basic needs, I'm going to borrow, Stephen Covey was a productivity expert. I'm borrowing his analogy of a glass jar. And I have to put, as a parent, I need to make sure that my child's 7 basic needs go in the jar. They're a bit like rocks or marbles. And I put those needs in the jar first. Then around that, there's usually some white space, or I may not fill up the whole jar with their needs. That tells me I've got ample time for screen time, and I don't have to fret and panic that it's ruining them or harming or derailing their development. But what's happening in many households throughout the world is that we empty the jar, we fill it up with screen time, and all of a sudden we're seeing young people who are not physically active, who aren't getting sufficient amounts of sleep, who aren't getting ping pong serve and return interaction and language skills. So that's the formula that I recommend, and it helps alleviate, I think many parents experience techno guilt, so it gets rid of that.
Yeah, I love that word, techno guilt, and I'm sure, and as a school, we hear this a lot too, like what is too much and how many hours and how many classes can they participate in. And it's really interesting to hear that it is all about balance. And as a teacher in the past and as a professional and working from home especially, I think that's something that we all strive for, is to find balance. But I like what you said about meeting the basic needs first,
yes,
and then adding in the screen time. That's
right.
Yeah. And how can parents kind of avoid techno guilt? What is the way, and how can they have these conversations with their kids as they grow older to help them find the balance and kind of their own mental check-in for their technology use?
Great question. And so I would say my message to all parents, whether you've got a small child or an adolescent, is that parents need to be the pilot, not the passenger of the digital plane. And so parents need to assume that active role. And many parents say, but my 5-year-old knows more about technology than what I do. I'm ill-equipped to be the pilot of the digital plane. And I agree, your 5-year-old probably does know way more about the technology than what you do, but what your child, and in fact your adolescent, does not have that you do have, that is essential to navigate this digital terrain, is that you've got 2 things. The first thing is you've got a fully developed prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that helps with those executive function skills I mentioned a little earlier. Its 3 big jobs is to manage impulses, so it's the self-regulation center of the brain, it's working memory, and it's mental flexibility. Your children don't have self-regulation skills. This is why it is an unrealistic expectation to think that your son will play, 3 hours of a video game and turn it off voluntarily and say, I have had a sufficient amount of gaming, I'm going to put the console away and go and tidy my bedroom. That's completely unrealistic expectation. This is why we've got teenagers throwing techno-tantrums when we ask them to digitally disconnect. They don't have self-regulation skills, and that's always been the case. That this isn't anything new. This hasn't been caused by technology. This is just a biological evolution. However, what is different is that we are now thrusting kids into a digital world where they're being challenged constantly to self-regulate. One of the reasons why children, in fact, why all of us seduced to digital distractions, is because we lack that self-regulation part of the brain. Particularly given that we know that part of the brain isn't fully developed until early 20s for females and late 20s for males. I can hear the gasps of people who are listening to that. So we've got to, I think, have realistic expectations, and that's why parents have that pivotal role to play. The second thing that parents have that children and adolescents don't have is we've got hindsight. We've got a catastrophe scale. We've got life experience. And our kids don't. Again, this isn't anything new. This hasn't been caused because of technology. But what we are giving kids when we're thrusting them into this digital world are very, very powerful digital tools. And children, many people talk about digital footprints, and I think that's an important term. I like to use the analogy of digital DNA. And it's this idea that every comment, every post, everything that we look up is leaving behind sprinklings of our digital DNA. And if our young people don't have self-regulation skills and they don't have life experience to sort of recalibrate what they're doing, they are going to end up in possibly dangerous or unhealthy situations. So this is why you may not have the technical prowess as a parent, but you do have that prefrontal cortex and life experience to help your children navigate the digital world. And so then I say to parents, if you are the pilot of the plane, you've just got to get 3 Bs. The first thing is to come up with boundaries with your kids beyond the how much. Also looking at, we talked about before, what, when, how, and with whom they use it. The second thing is to make sure you're preserving their basic needs. Are you making sure that their tech time isn't interfering with their basic developmental priorities? And the third one, and I know this is contentious, is promoting boredom. More than ever, young children and adolescents need digital disconnection and white space and time for their brain to meander. So again, a long-winded answer, but a really important question for parents to sort of reconcile and know that they can be the pilot of the plane.
Yeah, what an important thing to take away there is that giving them that white space. And we see that so much when kids do move from a school into an alternative education like we have at Galileo, and how they have more freedom and the ability to fill this space, but not with a device. So wow.
So important. And I do a lot of work in the corporate sector. And one of the key things that I say to big corporate teams is if you want optimal productivity and you want to be at peak performance, your brain, we basically have ancient Paleolithic brains operating in this high-tech world, and they haven't evolved to be constantly switched on processing information. So you need to digitally disconnect. You need, neuroscientists call it the default mode of thinking. We used to call it daydreaming, but we need white space. And as you said, Kelly, we need not to be filling that with scrolling or tapping or swiping.
Right. And about the techno-tantrums, what is the best age to start this conversation? I mean, obviously you can't go home with your 6-month-old and talk about this with him, about Baby Einstein videos, but how young can they begin these conversations about fulfilling the 3 Bs?
So I strongly encourage parents that the minute you hand over a digital device, even if it is to a toddler, that you start to implement some firm boundaries, because very quickly it can become a slippery slope. The minute your no doesn't mean a firm no, or it means, implement some pester power, and mum or dad may renegotiate their screen time boundaries, we open the floodgates. So I say to parents, start early. I run a lot of seminars to parents of adolescents, and so many parents say to me, I wished I'd implemented this earlier. Many parents have their hands in the air, particularly of sort of upper primary and in secondary school. Many parents are saying the horse has bolted. I really wished I'd implemented these strategies earlier on, because it will, and I often say to parents, think about future you. Future you will do the hard work now, and it will pay dividends further on down the track. But it is very hard to try and implement some of these strategies retrospectively. So it's about, and again, coming up with realistic solutions. One of the reasons we know we get techno-tantrums is because the brain is craving dopamine. When our kids are online, it's usually pleasurable. They get rewarded, they get praised, they move up levels, they get very tangible evidence of their success. So the brain secretes dopamine, and so the brain wants more and more of that. That's one of the reasons why kids find it hard to unplug. So this is where, as a parent, if you've got some strategies in place, so before you're going to make them end whatever it is they're doing online, whether it's sort of a leisure or a learning activity, we call it cognitive priming, but it basically means warn them that their time is going to come to an end. We don't go in midway through an episode or midway through a learning experience and expect them to terminate it. The second thing is to have an appealing transition activity. Don't take your digital devices off your children and ask them to go and tidy their bedroom, or go and do, some tedious, I'm going to pick on maths activities here, but some tedious maths activity, because they're not going to get the dopamine. Set up limits. One of the biggest things all of us, kids, adolescents and adults, struggle with in the online world is, we call it the state of insufficiency. And it's this idea that we never feel done. We never feel complete. The online world is a bottomless bowl. And now YouTube, Netflix, and most commercial streaming services have set the default mechanism as the autoplay feature. So can you go into your devices and disable that particular feature? So look what we can do, what's within our control. It's going to let our kids use the technology, but to use it in ways that is congruent with their developmental needs and abilities as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. So are some features or settings built into some of these apps and different programs that we use that we can change this. I recently got a new smartphone, and it said I can put it into grayscale, and I know that there are apps that you can also get to measure the activity that you have on certain devices. Would you recommend parents and children to observe their use in this way?
Absolutely. One of the things I often say to people is use technology to, ironically, tame your technology habits. One of the reasons is that our brain looks for the easy option. And so saying we're going to use willpower and really restrict and limit what we do, I think even as adults, we would acknowledge that we don't have that willpower. And part of the reasoning behind that, when you understand the science behind it, is that when we do something pleasurable, as I mentioned before, our brain gives us hits of dopamine. Now, unfortunately, when our brain releases dopamine, sometimes that dopamine goes to that prefrontal cortex. It floods that part of the brain that helps us with self-regulation. So even if we do have self-regulation skills, when we get a hit of that dopamine, it turns that part of the brain off. This is why, for me, my weakness is sometimes dark chocolate. And I will say, I'm just going to have one little square of dark chocolate, and I get that hit of dopamine, and 1 becomes 2 becomes 4. It's that dopamine hijacking the logical part of my brain. So I think it's about equipping ourselves with that knowledge so that we can use the technology, but use it, depending on what platform, and each platform has different capabilities. But using that grayscale feature is fantastic, because I will admit social media is very boring to consume in black and white. Using some of the built-in features that will restrict how much time you can spend on particular platforms, or even just monitoring. I know many people, when they downloaded the iOS screen time feature, were horrified when they got quantitative evidence of just how much time they were spending. So I think definitely using those. One of my best apps that I personally use and recommend to students is an app called Forest, and it works on all platforms, and it's gamifying our screen time, ironically. But what you do is set a nominated period of time where you don't want to be distracted. So let's say you're doing some online learning and you want to really focus on the learning task, but you don't want to be tempted to pick up your phone. You set the Forest app for your designated period of time. If you manage to succeed in not picking it up, you plant a digital tree. And if you pick up your device in that time, you kill the tree. Now, simple game, but for me, this is how I'm writing my next book. Ironically, the book is on adult digital well-being, but if there is something very easy but fun about that. The other thing, this company is also planting trees in real life as well. So there's sort of a social responsibility piece there, which I really like as well. So I think definitely use the technology to your advantage to sort of curtail your use, because relying on willpower, most of us will fail at that, unfortunately.
Right, and as adults, it's hard for us to do it. So how can we expect kids to do it as well? So that's a really good
Completely.
I love that app too. I'm going to look into that. Thank you for that.
Have a look.
So moving into the future, how do we see the future looking in terms of digital well-being, and what can we do to better prepare ourselves for what's next? I mean, we couldn't predict TikTok was going to explode the way it did. So of course we can't predict the future, but how can we do the best for technology use?
So I do agree. Most of us didn't anticipate any of the apps that have come into existence. And so this is why I say to parents, you've got to be that pilot of the digital plane, and you need to try and look at what's on the radar. Where are the places where your kids, the digital places where they're going to want to congregate? And when they ask for an app or they want to use a new platform or there's a new game, you as the pilot do due diligence. Look into what are the potential, what's the pitfalls, so you can make educated decisions. Often what our kids do is form a coalition amongst themselves and say, everybody has this app, or all of my friends have this app. And it's usually closely followed by, I will be, for want of a better word, they often don't use the word ostracized, but I will be ostracized if I'm the only person in my peer group not playing that, using that, or doing that online activity. And so I say to parents, do fact check that first and foremost, because they do form these digital coalitions to try and coerce and trick parents into doing that. But then go and try to avoid asking advice from fellow parents, because many parents are perpetuating misinformation. So go to reliable sources. Globally, I would highly recommend Common Sense Media for really non-biased advice on apps and the latest risks and digital dilemmas. Each country, I'm sure, has their own other platforms as well, but I particularly like Common Sense Media for sort of their global approach. So do due diligence. I think that technology, as we've experienced during this health pandemic, it is that portal. It's not going away. It's not a phase your kids are going through. The reality is it's here. And I think our job as parents is to prepare our kids for this digital world. And the only way they can be prepared is through actually using the technology. So use it with them, show them how to use it respectfully and responsibly, put those boundaries in place so that it's not, derailing or harming their development. And the hardest bit, and I say this as a mum and also as a researcher, is being a good digital role model yourself. And I totally admit, easier said than done, but we know that our young people, their brains have mirror neurons, meaning that they're wired to imitate. So if we are constantly tethered to our technology, we can see why our kids will emulate those behaviours too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm interested in your perspective about gaming. So we know that a lot of educational apps have turned into games, and in terms of social media, it can be a slippery slope. How do we find the balance, and what do you think is appropriate for our students for ages, starting as young as 8? And how do we find the balance between what's educational and what is too violent, and alleviate some of the parents' concerns in this way?
Absolutely. And I think you've talked there very clearly, Kelly, about what the issue is. It's content really is king. What content is embedded in the game? Because, playing a maths game is very different in most instances to playing a first-person shooter game. So knowing, and again, this is where I say to parents, do due diligence. Find out what content, perhaps even download the app or game and play it yourself. So I think it's about really drilling down into what they're doing and what is age appropriate. So it's not so much that they're gaming, it's what are they gaming. We can have multiplayer video games that promote pro-social messages. And again, your child best. If you know that being exposed to antisocial, violent video game content might be a trigger for them to imitate and emulate it because perhaps they've got some concerning behaviours, I would suggest avoiding that. If you know your child's fairly well emotionally adjusted, that you're going to have some firm boundaries around how much time they're spending on it, then perhaps playing those games if they're old enough. One of the reasons I say to parents, be cautious about introducing it, particularly before 8, is because the brain really finds it hard to distinguish between fiction and reality before then. So whilst we might look at a video game and say, well, that's fictional, I can see their avatars and they're not real characters, many young children fail to make that distinction. And then if they are rewarded in the game for engaging in antisocial, violent, aggressive, misogynistic behaviours, we can see why they then can start to imitate it because of those mirror neurons. So I think gaming, again, find out the what. Social media, I say to parents, delay the introduction of social media for as long as possible. 13 years is the legal requirement for most platforms, but that's not when children are psychologically ready. Many parents are sort of under the misguided belief that that's the age limit when their brains or they're sort of emotionally ready to cope. It's not. It's based on COPPA law, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, when it becomes legal for tech companies to obtain data from children. I am yet, as I say, I speak to thousands, tens of thousands of parents, and I am yet to meet a parent who says to me, I really regret holding off on introducing smartphones and social media to my kids, but I have plenty of parents who say the opposite. So yeah, where you can, delay it, and then when they do use it, teach them. Don't give them a gaming console or a smartphone and expect that they will learn these skills through osmosis. They won't. They need explicit and ongoing instruction on our behalf.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think that's a really good lesson too, and social media to delay, that's really good to know as well. I think when I was young, it was much different, and with the times changing, it's good to know how we can prepare for the future as well. And in terms of your own personal self, what is your own personal drive, and how do you see the future changing for you?
So my personal drive, I am a self-confessed nerd. I am a lover of research and science. So particularly in this parenting space, parenting is a very polarizing topic. People have very entrenched philosophical views, which is fine, and I completely support that. But given that technology is a particularly polarizing topic, for me, I'm driven by science, and data, and by running that science and data through your heart, and saying what resonates for me, what will work for our family context, what do I know sits well for me, because at the end of the day, we are hardwired for our number one psychological need is the need for relational connection. So I think I am very much driven by that research and science side, but running it through that sort of filter of connection and love. So looking, I'm really excited about what the research we're garnering in terms of the impact technology is having on our well-being, on children's capacity to learn, I think is really exciting. And for me, I sort of see myself as a conduit between that research and science and what's relevant and realistic, so that I don't see other parents having incorrect health advice being given out from their local healthcare professional. And to arm parents, I think in parents' defence, we are the very first generation of parents who are navigating this complete digital world with our kids. For most of us, we had predominantly analogue childhoods. We stared at the sky, not at a screen. We spent time with people, not with pixels. So I really am passionate about giving parents research-based information so that they can better navigate this digital world without that techno-guilt we talked about earlier.
Wow. And for some lasting advice for our parents who are watching, many of them are making the shift, if not already, into alternative education, trying to navigate between what's educational and what's just out there for fun to fulfill the boredom for their kids. What kind of lasting advice can we give to parents and to students who are watching as well about technology use?
I think being driven by active use of technology. So try, and again, it's not saying, you should never have passive consumption. I will admit, I have spent probably more time than ordinarily I would have binge watching some television shows, but we need to make sure that more of the time we are using technology as a tool in an active way. Are we using it to collaborate and connect with our peers or our friends or our families? Are we using it to consume information, and again, being mindful of what it is that we are consuming. Is it an educational tool to consume information? Are we using it as a purposeful tool to create digital content? Am I creating blog posts or animated stories or video content or podcasts? How am I using it in those particular ways? And trying to minimize the amount of time we have on that passive consumption, because that's when I think we can tap into the really rich potential of technology and sort of leverage the benefits that it offers all of us.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristy, for your time. And it was great to hear all of your expert advice for our parents and students watching about digital use and well-being. If you wish to learn more about Dr. Kristy Goodwin, you can visit her website at drkristygoodwin.com. Thank you so much, Kristy.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.